It was the spring of 1984, in the quiet farm country outside Cedar Hollow, Missouri. A young couple named Daniel and Ruth Vance loaded their car one Sunday evening and drove off into the dusk with their 4-month-old daughter, Emily. They were never seen again. Their car turned up 2 counties east, doors unlocked, the baby's bottle still warm in the cup holder. Police walked the fields and dragged the river and knocked on every door for miles. They found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no note. The case quickly went cold, and for 4 decades it stayed that way, a runaway family, the file said, gone to escape their debts. 40 years later, one small detail reopened the case. A single strand of DNA entered into a database by a woman who had no idea what she was looking for, uncovered a truth no one was prepared for. What she found would not lead her to the missing. It would lead her to someone who had been standing in plain sight the whole time, and who didn't know who she really was. If stories like this matter to you, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel grow and lets us keep telling these forgotten stories. Now, let's get into today's case. To understand what happened 40 years later, you first have to understand the woman who found it. Her name was Karen Doyle, and in the autumn of 2024, she was 58 years old, a retired middle school science teacher living alone in a small brick house on a shaded street in Springfield, Illinois. Karen had never met Daniel or Ruth Vance. She had never heard of Cedar Hollow. She had no connection to the case at all. What she had was a hobby, and the hobby had quietly grown into the center of her life. Karen was a volunteer. 3 years earlier, after her husband, Bill, died of a stroke in the produce aisle of the grocery store with a bag of oranges still in his hand. The house had gone so quiet, she thought she might lose her mind inside it. She had raised no children, that grief was its own long story, and taught other people's for 34 years. And now there was no one to teach, and no one to cook for, and no one to argue with about the thermostat. She had needed something to do with her hands and her mind at 2 a.m, when sleep wouldn't come. She found a group of amateur genetic genealogists who worked with police departments to identify unknown remains. And she signed up on a whim. And within a month, she was hooked in a way she'd never been hooked on anything. It was slow, patient, maddening work. Somewhere in the country, a medical examiner would have a body bones found in a culvert, a skull turned up by a plow, a person pulled from a lake with no name and no one to claim them. They'd extract a DNA profile and upload it to a database. And people like Karen would spend their nights building family trees out of strangers. You'd start with the distant cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared a scrap of genetic code with the unknown dead, and you'd trace them backward through marriages and births and deaths and yellowed obituaries until, if you were patient and lucky and stubborn, 2 branches of a family tree would come together and point at a single name. And then a nameless body in a drawer would become somebody's daughter again, somebody's brother, somebody who could finally go home. Karen was good at it, better than good. She had the temperament for it, the same temperament that had made her the teacher kids came back to visit 20 years later. She was patient. She was methodical. She never rushed, never forced a connection that wasn't there, never let herself see a pattern just because she wanted to see one. Her friend Denise, from the genealogy group, said Karen could untangle a knot that would make anyone else throw the whole thing in the trash. She had her habits. She kept a coffee mug that read, "World's Okayest Grandma," a gag gift from Bill years ago, though she had no grandchildren and never would. She drank her coffee black and always let it go cold because she'd get lost in the data and forget it, and then drink it cold anyway rather than get up. She talked to her computer while she worked, small murmurs, come on, where do you go?" as though the numbers could hear her and might, if encouraged, behave. And she believed, quietly and completely, without any irony at all, that everyone deserved to be found. That no life was so small it could just be erased. She had lost people. She knew what it was to want, more than anything, one more piece of information about someone who was gone. It was a Tuesday night in October when the alert came in. She almost didn't open it. It was past 11. She'd spent the evening on a different case, a young man found in a Kentucky quarry in 1996, still unidentified. And she'd hit a wall, the way you always eventually did. And she was tired, and her back ached, and her coffee had gone cold 2 hours ago. The little notification blinked in the corner of her screen. New match, case number dash. Another remains case, one she'd flagged months ago and mostly forgotten. She thought about going to bed. She clicked it instead. She always clicked it. The screen filled with numbers, and something in the shape of those numbers made her sit up straight in her chair. Something felt wrong, really wrong. The case involved 2 sets of unidentified remains. She remembered them vaguely now. Remembered thinking there was something strange about the pairing when she'd first seen the file. A partial skeleton, an adult male, found by a fence line in rural Missouri in 1991. A hunter's dog had turned up the first bone. And a second set, adult female, found 11 miles away in 2003. When a construction crew widening a county road broke ground on what turned out to be a shallow grave. 2 counties, 12 years apart, and for over 2 decades, no one had ever connected them. 2 anonymous dead people, filed separately, forgotten separately. But the database had connected them now. And what it said stopped Karen's breath. The DNA said the man and the woman were not strangers to each other. They shared no direct blood, they weren't siblings, weren't cousins, but the algorithm had found something else, something it flagged in cases like this. They were linked through a third person, a child, the kind of genetic bridge that only exists between 2 people who made a baby together. The man and the woman, whoever they were, had been a couple. And somewhere out there was their child. And that was the part that made Karen set down her cold coffee with a hand that wasn't quite steady. Because the third profile, the child, was not a set of remains. It was a living person. Karen had been doing this for 3 years. She had matched the dead to the grieving more times than she could count now. Had made the phone calls, had heard the sounds people make when a 50-year hole in their life is suddenly filled. But she had never once seen a living person surface inside a remains case like this. The living almost never showed up. The living had no reason to be in a database built for the dead unless they had wandered in by accident. Through the front door of an ordinary consumer ancestry site. One of those kits people buy at the drugstore to find out whether they're a little bit Scottish. That was exactly what had happened. The living profile had been uploaded to one of the big commercial genealogy platforms, the kind advertised on television at Christmas. And its owner had ticked the box, the one almost nobody reads, allowing their DNA to be compared against law enforcement databases. Whoever this person was, they had spit into a plastic tube out of simple curiosity, sealed it in a prepaid envelope, dropped it in the mail, and gone on with their life. They had no idea that somewhere in the machinery of the thing, their genome would one day light up beside 2 murdered strangers in a cold case file. The match was unambiguous, the kind of number that leaves no room for doubt. The living person shared exactly the amount of DNA with each set of remains that a biological child shares with a biological parent. Half from the man, half from the woman. The 2 dead people were this living person's mother and father. Karen wrote one word in the spiral notebook she kept beside her keyboard, and she underlined it twice, and then a third time, pressing so hard the pen tore the paper. Otter. She sat back. The house ticked and settled around her. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and went quiet. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. If these two murdered people had a daughter, and the daughter was alive, then where had she been all these years? Why hadn't she reported her own parents missing? Why hadn't she been reported missing? And why did the database have no name for the parents at all? Not a case number that led to a real investigation, not a missing persons report. Nothing but two anonymous sets of bones filed under unidentified and left to gather dust for decades in two different counties. Two people had been murdered and buried miles apart. Their daughter was alive, and from the look of that profile, living an ordinary life somewhere. And nobody, in 40 years, had ever connected any of it. Karen did what she always did when the questions piled up faster than the answers. She stopped asking them, and she started building the tree. The living profile came displayed the way those platforms always displayed them, a first name and a last initial, to protect privacy. Amanda R. That was all. Karen couldn't see her face, couldn't see her age. Beyond an estimate the system generated from certain genetic markers, which put her right around 58, Karen's own age. Couldn't see where she lived, what she did, whether she was married, whether she had children of her own. All Karen had were the segments, the shared pieces of DNA that connected Amanda R. to hundreds of distant genetic cousins scattered across the country, third cousins, fourth cousins, fifth people who had also bought kits, also ticked the box, also left their family trees public for anyone to see. It was like being handed a photograph torn into 1,000 pieces, with all the middle pieces missing, and being told to rebuild the whole picture from the ragged edges inward. Karen made a fresh pot of coffee. It was nearly midnight. She did not go to bed. She worked through that night, and she barely noticed the sky going gray. She built outward from the most distant matches because that was where you always started the far edges. The fifth cousins, the ones who shared just enough to prove a connection and just little enough that their trees were easy to fill in without stepping on the mystery at the center. Name by name, marriage by marriage, census record by census record. She followed a Wilson who married a Fry who begat a Coleman who moved from Tennessee to Missouri in the 1920s. She followed the obituaries, which were their own kind of poetry. Survived by, preceded in death by, will be greatly missed, each one a little door into a family. She slept a few hours after dawn, face down on the couch, and got up and did it again. And on the third night, the branches began to take a recognizable shape. Two great limbs were forming on either side of Amanda R. On one side, a family that traced back through rural Missouri or farmers, mostly Methodists, people who named their sons after Bible prophets and stayed on the same land for generations. On the other side, a family from just across the state line, town people, a father who'd run a hardware store, daughters who sang in church. The two limbs reached toward each other across the empty space at the center of the tree, where Amanda R. sat alone. And Karen knew the way she always eventually knew that if she could just find the two people where these limbs joined, she would have the parents. The man in the culvert, the woman in the road. On the fourth night, she found them. The Missouri branch narrowed to a single young man. The town branch narrowed to a single young woman. And a marriage record from 1982, filed in a little Missouri County courthouse, joined them. She had their names now. She typed them into her notebook beneath the word daughter, and she looked at them for a long moment before she searched them, because some part of her already understood that whatever came up was going to change everything. Daniel Vance, Ruth Vance. She searched the names, and the first thing that filled her screen made her blood run cold. It was a scanned newspaper page from a small Missouri paper dated the last week of May, 1984. The headline read, in the plain, heavy type of a small-town press, "Young family vanishes, car found abandoned." Below it, a photograph, grainy from 40 years of microfilm and rescanning, but clear enough. A young couple, close together, the man's arm around the woman's shoulders. The woman was holding a baby wrapped in a pale blanket. All three were smiling. The caption named them Daniel Vance, 24, Ruth Vance, 22, and their infant daughter Emily, 4 months old. All three vanished without a trace, the article read. Police believe the family may have fled the county to escape mounting financial difficulties. Karen read it twice. 3 times. She looked at the baby in the photograph. A small, pale bundle, a tuft of dark hair, one tiny fist escaping the blanket. She looked back at the living profile glowing on the other half of her screen. Amanda R. Estimated age, 58. Biological daughter of 2 sets of unidentified remains. Emily Vance had been 4 months old in the spring of 1984. Amanda R. was 58 years old in the autumn of 2024. The arithmetic clicked into place like a lock. The 2 sets of remains, the man by the fence, the woman in the road, were Daniel and Ruth Vance, who had supposedly run away 40 years ago. They hadn't run anywhere. They had been murdered and buried and left nameless for decades. And the baby. The baby the whole county believed had vanished with them, carried off to some new life in California or Mexico or wherever runaway debtors were imagined to go. The baby was alive. She had never vanished at all. She was 58 years old, and she was sitting somewhere at this very moment in some ordinary house, with no idea that she was the center of the oldest unsolved mystery in Cedar Hollow, Missouri. Karen Doyle put her face in her hands and, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, began to cry. Now, let me take you back to Cedar Hollow, to the spring of 1984, to the family in that photograph, and to the one person who loved them enough to spend the next 40 years refusing to believe the lie. Daniel Vance was born on a hard-scrabble dairy farm at the edge of Cedar Hollow, the older of 2 sons. And everyone who knew him growing up said the same thing about him. He was steady. He wasn't the smartest boy in the county or the strongest or the loudest. He was the one who showed up, the one who finished what he started, the one who, when the Peterson barn burned in '78, was there before the fire trucks with a bucket in each hand, and there after they left, helping shovel the ash. He fell in love with Ruth Ellison at 16 in the choir loft of the Cedar Hollow Methodist Church. And he never so much as looked at another girl after that. Ruth had a laugh you could hear from across a room, bright and sudden and slightly embarrassing to her. And she was forever pressing her hand to her mouth to try to stop it, which only made it worse. She had a habit of humming hymns under her breath while she worked, Blessed Assurance mostly, which she claimed she didn't even like. She wanted to be a school teacher. She was 2 exams away from her certificate when she found out she was expecting. And she set the certificate aside without complaint, because that was the sort of thing people did then, and told everyone she'd finish it later. She meant to. She'd have made a wonderful teacher. Karen Doyle, 40 years later, would think about that a great deal, that she and this murdered girl had wanted the exact same life. Daniel and Ruth married in the fall of 1982. Too young, everyone said. And they were happy in the specific, breakable way of people who don't yet know how hard the world can be. Daniel took over the farm when his father's health began to fail. Ruth kept the books at the kitchen table with a pencil behind her ear. In January of 1984, in the deep cold, their daughter Emily was born. And the nurses at the county hospital would tell the story for years afterward of the young farmer who wept openly in the hallway, who had to sit down on the floor with his back against the wall because his legs wouldn't hold him, undone completely by 7 pounds of baby girl. But there was another person in this house, and in this story, and his love would outlast every other love in it. His name was Thomas Vance, Daniel's little brother. Thomas was 19 in the spring of 1984, all knees and elbows, and Adam's apple. A boy still finishing the long, awkward business of becoming a man. Their mother had died when Thomas was 11 and Daniel 18, and their father had folded up into himself with grief and work. So it was Daniel who'd finished raising Thomas, more or less. Daniel who taught him to drive the old truck in the back 40, grinding the gears, both of them laughing. Daniel who taught him to shave, standing behind him at the bathroom mirror, guiding his hand. Daniel who taught him to throw a punch when the Kessler boys wouldn't leave him alone at school. And more importantly, Daniel always said when not to. Thomas worshipped his brother with the pure, uncomplicated devotion of a boy who has one solid thing in an unsteady world. And he adored Ruth. Ruth, who had folded him into the little family without a second thought. Who always cut him the corner piece of the cake because she knew he liked the extra frosting. Who teased him mercilessly about the girls at school and then gave him real advice when he actually needed it. When Emily was born, Thomas became an uncle at 19, and he took the office with total seriousness. He was terrified to hold her at first, such a small thing, so breakable. And then he couldn't be talked into putting her down. In the weeks before Emily came, Thomas had made her something. He wasn't good with words, never had been, but he was good with his hands. He took a block of soft basswood out to the barn, and over 3 careful weeks, he carved her a little bird. A wren, because the wrens nested in the eaves of the barn every spring. And he'd always liked them, plain brown birds with more song in them than any right to be. He carved it and sanded it smooth as river stone, every edge rounded so a baby couldn't hurt herself on it. And he oiled it until the grain glowed. And he set it in Emily's crib the day they brought her home. Remember the wren? Everything comes back to the wren. The trouble on the farm, when it came, was money the way it nearly always is. Daniel had borrowed heavily to keep the land through 2 bad years, and the man he'd borrowed from was not a bank. His name was Vernon Case. Vernon Case was, in 1984, the most powerful man in Cedar Hollow, and one of the most powerful in the county. He owned the feed store and the grain elevator, which meant he touched nearly every farm for 30 miles. A farmer bought his feed from Vernon and sold his grain to Vernon. And the price of both was whatever Vernon said it was. He held mortgages on half the county besides. He was a smiling, silver-haired man of about 50, with a soft voice and a soft handshake, who wore good suits to church and gave generously to the building fund and lent money to struggling farmers at rates that sounded like mercy and worked like a noose. Somehow, when a farm finally failed, and under Vernon's terms, a struggling farm always eventually failed. The land ended up in Vernon Case's name. Piece by piece, decade by decade, Vernon had assembled an empire out of other men's ruin. People in Cedar Hollow were afraid of Vernon Case. If you'd asked them why, most of them couldn't have told you exactly. There were stories. A man who'd argued with Vernon over a grain weight and lost his barn to a fire the next month. A county assessor who'd started asking questions about Vernon's books and abruptly took a job in another state. Nothing you could prove, nothing you could point to. Just a coldness under the silver smile, and a general county-wide understanding that you did not cross Vernon case. Daniel Vance owed Vernon a great deal of money. And in the spring of 1984, Daniel had begun to notice things. Something felt wrong, really wrong. It started small. Daniel hauled a load of grain to Vernon's elevator, and the weight came back lighter than he knew that load to be, because he'd weighed it himself on the co-op scale in the next county, on a hunch, before he brought it in. The difference was small, a few percent, easy to blame on a miscalibrated scale, on damp, on anything. But Daniel was steady, and steady men keep records. He started weighing every load twice, once on the honest co-op scale, once at Vernon's, and writing both numbers in a little notebook he kept in his coat pocket. Thomas saw the notebook once. He'd come into the kitchen and found Daniel hunched over it at the table late at night, adding columns of figures, his jaw tight. When Thomas asked what it was, Daniel looked up at him with an expression Thomas had never seen on his brother's face before. Not fear exactly, something harder. "Vernon's robbing half the county, Tommy," he said quietly. "Every load. A little off every load for years. Do you know what that adds up to? Do you know how many farms he's put under with a crooked scale?" He tapped the notebook. "I can prove it. It's all right here. I've got the co-op weights, and I've got his weights, and I've got the dates. I'm going to take it to the state AG board." Thomas didn't understand it then. His careful, cautious brother, picking a fight with the most dangerous man in the county over a few percent of grain weight, it didn't make sense. It just didn't. But he understood later. He understood that it was never really about the money for Daniel. It was that Daniel had figured out how many families had lost everything to that crooked scale. And that Daniel, being who he was, simply could not know a thing like that and do nothing. Ruth was frightened. Thomas remembered the argument, the two of them in the kitchen, voices held down to fierce whispers so that they wouldn't wake the baby. "These are dangerous people, Daniel. Please, let's just find a way to pay him and be done and get out from under." And Daniel, gentle but immovable, "Somebody has to, Ruth. If not me, who? Everyone in this county is too scared." And that's exactly how he gets away with it. Thomas never forgot Ruth's face that night. She wasn't angry. She was afraid deeply, specifically afraid. The way you're afraid when you can see a thing coming that the person you love refuses to see. The last time Thomas saw his brother alive was a Sunday evening in the last week of May. It was warm. The first real warmth of the year. The fields greening up. The light gone long and gold the way it does in late spring. Daniel and Ruth were dressed nicely. Daniel in a collared shirt, Ruth in a blue dress Thomas had seen her wear to church. Emily was bundled in a soft yellow blanket despite the warmth. The way you overbundle a first baby. Daniel said they were driving over to Ruth's sister's place, an hour east, to stay the night and come back Monday. He said it easily, but Thomas would remember, 40 years later, that Daniel hadn't quite met his eyes when he said it. At the door, Daniel clapped Thomas on the shoulder the way he always did and said, "Watch the cows for me, Tommy. Milking's at 5. I'll be back tomorrow." Ruth kissed Thomas on the cheek and told him there was a chicken in the icebox for his supper. And Emily, 4 months old, wide awake, staring at everything with the huge, serious eyes of a baby who is still deciding what to make of the world, reached out and grabbed Thomas's offered finger and held on with that startling strength babies have, and wouldn't let go, and everyone laughed. Then they got in the car, and Daniel backed it down the gravel drive, and they pulled out onto the county road and drove east into the last of the gold light. Thomas stood in the yard and watched until the car was a speck and then nothing. He went in and ate the cold chicken alone. He milked the cows at 5 the next morning. His brother did not come back the next day, or ever. The car was found on Wednesday, 2 days later, by a farmer named Boyle, who lived out on a gravel road in the next county over, 60 miles from anywhere the Vances had any reason to be. It was parked crooked on the shoulder, half in the ditch weeds, as though it had pulled over in a hurry or been pushed. The keys were gone, the doors were unlocked, and inside, the details that would haunt everyone who saw them. Ruth's purse sat on the passenger seat, open, her wallet inside it, $41 in cash untouched. Emily's diaper bag was in the back, packed with clean folded clothes and a spare bottle. And in the cup holder between the seats sat a baby bottle, half full of formula. And when Deputy Boone first reached in and touched it that Wednesday, he swore it was still faintly warm, which couldn't have been true, not after 2 days, and he knew it couldn't, and he said it anyway for the rest of his life, because that was how the whole scene felt. Warm, recent, interrupted, as though the family had been there a moment ago and would be back any second, and had instead simply stepped out of the world. There was no sign of Daniel, Ruth, or Emily. No blood, no struggle, no bodies. Nothing. They had vanished without a trace. The detective who caught the case was a man named Roy Alder. He was 59 years old, close to retirement, and he was tired in the specific way of a man who has spent a career watching bad things happen to people who didn't deserve them, and being able to do almost nothing about it. He had a bad hip and a metal thermos of black coffee and a filing cabinet full of cases that never closed. He walked the scene on that gravel road slowly, twice, and he did not like what his gut was telling him, because Roy Alder had been doing this a long time, and he knew things in his bones that he could not put in a report. He knew that a family fleeing debt does not leave $41 in cash on the seat. He knew that a mother who is running away to start a new life takes the diaper bag she has carefully packed. She doesn't leave it in the abandoned car. He knew that people who choose to disappear do not park crooked on a gravel road 60 miles off their route and walk into empty fields, leaving a warm bottle behind. Every instinct he had told him that this was not a family that ran. This was a family that was taken. But instinct is not evidence. And Roy Alder had no evidence. He had a clean car, a purse full of cash, and 3 people who had evaporated. The K-9 units came out, and their dogs picked up the family's scent from the car and followed it maybe 100 yards down the gravel road and then lost it completely at the tree line, as though the Vances had walked to that spot and been lifted straight up into the air. Divers went into the muddy river a mile off and found nothing but a sunk tractor tire and a rusted bicycle. Forensics went over the car and found only the family's own fingerprints and hairs. Search parties walked the surrounding fields in long lines for a solid week. Dozens of volunteers, neighbors, the whole of Cedar Hollow, it seemed. And at the very front of every line, every single day, calling his brother's name until his voice cracked and gave out entirely, was 19-year-old Thomas Vance. They found nothing. Not a scrap of cloth, not a shoe, not a single trace of a 4-month-old baby. One clue haunted Roy Alder to the end of his days. In the soft mud of the shoulder, just behind where the Vance car sat, he found a tire track that did not belong. It wasn't from the Vance vehicle he checked carefully on his hands and knees with his bad hip screaming. It was wider. A heavy vehicle, a large truck, the kind used to haul grain or livestock or anything else. He photographed it from 3 angles. He made a plaster cast of the clearest portion. He measured the tread width and the wheelbase as best he could from the single track. Someone with a big truck had pulled off on that lonely gravel road, right behind the Vance car, at some point around when they disappeared. He was sure it mattered. He was sure of it in his bones. But then the other story took hold. The story about debts and running away. And the man who told it was Vernon Case. Vernon told it first, and most persuasively, to the county sheriff, over lunch at the diner 3 days after the car was found. He was so sorry to hear about young Daniel, Vernon said, shaking his silver head. Such a shame. But between them and Vernon lowered his soft voice, Daniel had been in over his head. Way over. Owed money all over the county, not just to Vernon. Had been talking in recent weeks about how he wished he could just start fresh somewhere far away, leave all his troubles behind. Vernon hated to say it, but it wouldn't surprise him one bit if that's exactly what the boy had done. Packed up his pretty wife and his baby and lit out in the night for California to escape what he owed. Left the car so it couldn't be traced. People did desperate things when they were desperate. Such a shame. The sheriff nodded along. The sheriff, it happened, owed Vernon Case money too. Nearly everyone with any authority in that county owed Vernon Case something. And that was precisely the point. That was the empire. That was how it worked. The runaway theory went into the official report. The unmatched tire track went into a box. No one ever tracked down whose big truck had idled on that gravel shoulder. The searches were called off. The file was stamped. Within a month, the case quickly went cold. Thomas Vance was 19 years old, and he did not believe one single word of it, and he never would. He knew his brother. Daniel would sooner have cut off his own hand than abandon the farm, their father's farm, their dead mother's farm, the land Daniel had bled and worried over for years. Daniel would never have left the cows without arranging for someone to milk them. He'd told Thomas to milk them, expecting to be back. And Daniel, this was the thing Thomas knew with the deepest certainty of all. Daniel would never in 1,000 years have left Thomas behind. Not without a word, not without a note. They were all each other had. The runaway story wasn't just wrong. It was an insult to everything Daniel had ever been. And Thomas knew who was telling the story. 3 days after the car was found, half out of his mind with grief and rage, Thomas drove to Vernon Case's big house on the hill and stood on his wide front porch and pounded on the door and, when Vernon opened it, accused him to his face of doing something to his brother. He didn't even know what he was accusing him of. He just knew, with the animal certainty of love, that this smiling man was at the bottom of it. Vernon Case looked at the shaking boy on his porch, and he smiled his soft silver smile, and he said, "Son, I know you're hurting. Grief makes people say foolish things they don't mean. Go on home now. Get some rest." And he nodded to 2 men who had appeared behind him. Big men. Men who worked at Vernon's elevator, and they walked Thomas, not roughly but unmistakably, back to his truck. And as Thomas climbed in, one of them leaned down to the window, close, and said in a low, flat, friendly voice, so only Thomas could hear, "Careful where you go poking around, boy. These roads out here can be real dangerous after dark." Thomas drove home shaking. He never forgot that voice. 40 years later, he could still hear it, flat and friendly and cold. And he would recognize it the moment he heard it again, but that comes much later. And then the years began to pass. They passed the way years pass when you are waiting for someone who is never going to come. Slowly, and then all at once, and then slowly again. Thomas kept the farm. He was 19 and alone, and it was far too much for him. And he kept it anyway, out of nothing but stubbornness and love, because it was the last thing his brother's hands had touched. He learned to do the work of 3 men. He let no one buy an acre. when people gently suggested that Daniel wasn't coming back, that Thomas should sell up and go live his own life. He looked at them until they stopped talking. In 1988, he married a girl named Susan, a quiet, patient woman who worked at the county library and understood, she said so plainly, before she'd marry him, that she was marrying a man who was also married to a ghost, to a search, to a wound that would never close. She married him anyway. She was, everyone agreed, a saint. Thomas took the little wooden wren, Emily's wren, the one he'd carved, found still sitting on the shelf in the empty nursery after everyone else had given up, and stopped coming to the house, and he hung it on a nail above his workbench in the barn. And every day of his life, he looked at it. 5 years passed. Detective Roy Alder retired. Before he cleaned out his desk, he did something he had never done in 30 years on the job and knew he could be fired for. He drove out to the Vance farm, and he found Thomas in the barn, and he handed him a manila envelope. Inside were copies of the photographs of that unmatched tire track, the wide, heavy tread, the measurements in Alder's cramped hand. "I'm not supposed to have these anymore, and neither are you," Alder said. "But I couldn't put it in the ground with me, son. I always knew there was more to it. That story about them running, I never believed it, not for a day. Somebody with a big truck was on that road. And there's not many men in this county with trucks like that. And you and I both know who they work for." He couldn't say the name. Even retired, even then, he couldn't quite say it out loud. "I couldn't prove a thing, not one thing. And I am so sorry. I'm sorrier than I know how to say. But maybe someday, somehow, you hold on to this. You just hold on to it." Thomas held on to it. He put it in a shoebox under his bed, along with the newspaper clippings and Alder's business card. And over the years, the box grew heavier, more clippings, notes he made, names, a hand-drawn map of the county. He became, in the privacy of his own grief, an investigator with no case and no power, and no one who would listen. 10 years passed. In 1990, Thomas and Daniel's father died. He'd been failing for a while, but Thomas always believed the real cause was on the death certificate of the heart in a way no coroner would ever write down. In his last days, drifting, the old man kept asking for Daniel. Kept saying, softly, that he could hear the baby crying somewhere in the house, that someone ought to go and see to her. And Thomas would sit by the bed and hold his father's papery hand and lie to him, gently, the only mercy he had left to give Daniel's just out in the field, "Pop. He'll be in directly. The baby's fine. Susan's got her." The old man died still waiting for a son who was already 6 years in an unmarked grave by a fence line 11 miles away, though no one living knew that yet. In 1991, a hunter's dog found the first bone by that fence line. The county filed a set of unidentified adult male remains and finding no match to anyone reported missing, because the only missing man in the region was officially a runaway, not a victim, put the file in a drawer. Thomas never heard about it. Why would he? The dead man had no name. Vernon Case, meanwhile, grew richer and older and more respectable every year. He added to his land. He gave a new roof to the church and a new wing to the county hospital, and they put his name on a brass plaque. And in 1998, at 71, Vernon Case died peacefully in his sleep, in his big house on the hill, on land assembled from a dozen ruined families. And he was buried out of that same church he'd re-roofed, before a congregation of 200 mourners, most of whom were there because they were still, even at his funeral, afraid not to be. He was never questioned. He never spent an hour of his life under suspicion by anyone, but a grieving farmer nobody listened to. He got away with it, clean and complete, all the way to the grave. Thomas did not go to the funeral. He sat in his barn that day and looked at the wooden wren and, for the first time, felt something worse than grief. He felt the door closing. The one man who knew what had happened to his brother was in the ground now, and the truth was in there with him. 20 years passed, then 30. Thomas grew gray and then white, his shoulders rounded. The stubbornness that had held the farm together for so long finally started to lose to time and to his knees. And in his 50s, he sold off most of the land to a young couple, good people, who wanted to farm it right. But he kept the house, and he kept the barn, and he kept the 1 acre where the old barn stood, and he kept the wren. In 2003, a road crew 11 miles from the fence line broke ground on a shallow grave, and the county filed a second set of unidentified remains, adult female, in a second drawer, never connecting it to the first. Thomas never heard about that one either. Susan died in 2019 of cancer after 31 years of patient marriage to a haunted man. Thomas held her hand at the end the way he'd held his father's. After she was gone, the house was very quiet, and Thomas was a widower in his 60s, alone again the way he'd been alone at 19. Except now there was no farm to run and no searches to lead, and no one left who even remembered the names Daniel and Ruth Vance. To the young people in town, he was just the quiet old man on the Vance place, the one who kept a little wooden bird on a nail above his workbench and had never, in anyone's memory, explained why. He assumed he would die not knowing. Most nights, he had made his peace with that. He was tired, and he was old, and 40 years is a long time to carry a stone. Some nights, he'd sit in the dark of the barn with the wren in his hand, turning it over and over, the wood worn smooth as glass now by 4 decades of his thumb. And the piece would crack, and he would grieve as freshly as he had at 19. And he would say aloud to the empty barn, "Where are you, Danny? Where did they put you?" Then, on a gray afternoon in October of 2024, the phone rang, and everything suddenly changed. Karen Doyle had a terrible problem, and she'd spent 2 full days pacing her small brick house trying to solve it before she ever picked up the phone. She had a living woman, Amanda R., whose DNA proved beyond any doubt that she was the biological daughter of 2 murdered people. But Karen was a volunteer. The rules of the work she did were strict, and they existed for good reasons. Her job was to help identify the dead. Her job was to build the tree, put a name to the remains, and hand the file over to the professionals, the medical examiner, the police, the state cold case unit. Her job was absolutely not to go tearing into the private life of a living stranger and detonate everything that stranger believed about herself, because that was the part that had stopped Karen cold and kept her pacing. Amanda R. did not know. Karen had done enough of these cases to read what the data was screaming at her. She'd gone back into Amanda's public profile and studied the small family tree Amanda had built there, just a handful of people, her parents and their parents, the modest tree of someone doing the hobby casually, for fun. Amanda had listed a mother and a father, an Ohio couple, both now deceased. She'd listed them with the easy confidence of a woman recording plain facts about her own blood. And not one of them matched, not one. Amanda's hundreds of genetic cousins, the 3rd and 4th and 5th cousins, whose trees Karen had spent 4 sleepless nights climbing, were every one of them Vance's or Ruth's Ellison kin. They were the Missouri farmers and the town people across the state line. They were the family in the newspaper photograph. But the Ohio couple Amanda had listed as her own mother and father, they shared no DNA with Amanda whatsoever, none. They were not her blood. They were, genetically speaking, strangers who had raised her. Amanda had been raised by people who were not related to her. And Karen understood this slowly. And then all at once, and it made her sit down hard in her kitchen chair. Amanda plainly did not know it. If she'd known she was adopted, she'd have built her tree differently, searched differently, understood that her matches wouldn't line up. But she'd built it as though those Ohio parents were her blood, because she believed, with her whole heart, that they were. Someone had taken that baby out of that abandoned car on a gravel road in 1984. Someone had erased her name, her family, her whole origin, and folded her into a new life 2 states away, with new parents and a new name, so completely that the child herself had never suspected. And that stolen baby had grown into a 58-year-old woman who had spent her entire life not merely unaware of who her parents were, but unaware that she had ever been lost at all. She thought she was ordinary. She thought she was nobody's mystery. Karen sat with that for a long time in her quiet kitchen. And then she made a decision that broke every protocol of the work she did. And she has said since, without hesitation, that she would make the exact same decision again. Before she handed one page of this to the police, before the machinery of official investigation ground into motion and someone with a badge and no gentleness went knocking on Amanda's door, Karen decided she had to find the family. The Vance family. Someone who had loved these people, who had a right to know before the strangers did. She traced the Vance name forward out of the past and into the present, through property records and voter rolls, and the thin electronic trail an old life leaves, until she found him. Thomas Vance, 65 years old, Cedar Hollow, Missouri. Daniel Vance's younger brother, the baby's uncle, still living on the family land. Still, as far as any record showed, the last Vance standing. She dialed his number on a gray Tuesday afternoon in October, and her hand was not steady, and her heart was going hard, because in 3 years of this work, she had made many hard calls, but never one like this. Thomas almost didn't answer. He never answered numbers. He didn't know always some scam, some robot, some kid selling something. He'd let it ring and go to the machine he wasn't even sure still worked. But something, that afternoon, made him set down the wren and cross the barn and pick up the old phone on the wall. Hello? Mr. Vance, the woman's voice said. Mr. Thomas Vance. Speaking. If you're selling something, I'm not. I'm not selling anything, Mr. Vance. My name is Karen Doyle. You don't know me. I work with a group of volunteers who use DNA to identify missing people. People who've been lost a long time. She took a breath he could hear over the line. I'm calling about your brother, about Daniel and his wife, Ruth. The barn went very quiet around Thomas Vance. The wren sat on its nail. Dust turned slowly in a bar of gray light. He heard his own heartbeat. Say that again, he whispered. I found them, Mr. Vance. Her voice was breaking now, this stranger, this woman he'd never met, breaking on his brother's name. I am so sorry to be the one to tell you this over the phone. But I found Daniel and Ruth. After all these years, I found them. Thomas gripped the edge of his workbench with his free hand. 40 years rose up in him all at once. The gold light on the road, the warm bottle, his father asking for the baby, Susan's patient face, the flat, friendly voice at the truck window, 4 decades of a stone he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was a stone and thought it was just the shape of his own heart. They're dead, he said. It wasn't a question. He had always known. He had known since Wednesday, May of 1984, when they found the cash still in the purse. They've been dead all this time. Yes, Karen said gently. I'm so sorry. They were Mr. Vance. They didn't run away. They never ran away. I think you always knew that. I always knew that. His eyes were streaming now, silent, the way old men cry. Nobody ever believed me. 40 years, and nobody ever... He couldn't finish. I believe you, Karen said. The evidence believes you. And Mr. Vance... Her voice changed, and he heard her gather herself for something. There's more. There's something else I have to tell you, and I need you to sit down. Are you sitting down? I'm standing in my barn. Then hold on to something, please. A pause that seemed to last a year. The baby, Emily, your niece. Don't, Thomas breathed. 40 years he'd never let himself think about the baby. Not really, because that was the one grief that could actually kill him, that they'd killed a baby, his brother's baby, the child whose finger had gripped his own in the doorway. Please, ma'am, don't. She's alive, Karen said. Thomas, Emily is alive. The phone slid out of Thomas Vance's hand and swung on its cord against the wall. And from where it hung, Karen could hear the sound of a 65-year-old man weeping the way he had not wept since he was 19 years old, standing at the front of a search line in a Missouri field, screaming his brother's name into the coming dark. It was a long moment before he picked it back up. Karen waited. She had learned in this work how to wait. Say it again, he finally managed. Emily is alive. She's 58 years old. She survived. Someone took her out of that car that night, and instead of what they did to her parents, they gave her away. They gave her to another family, far away. And that family raised her and loved her and gave her a whole life. She grew up. She's alive. And she's well, Thomas. Karen's voice went soft and careful, because now came the hardest part, the part she'd been dreading. But I have to tell you something that's going to hurt. She doesn't know. She has no idea who she is. She thinks the people who raised her were her real parents. She spent her entire life not knowing she was ever missing, not knowing she was ever a Vance, not knowing any of it. To her, none of this ever happened. She's a stranger to her own story. And now the real investigation began, except this time, it wasn't a lonely old man with a shoebox and no one to listen. This time, it was two of them. A widower in a Missouri barn and a widow at an Illinois kitchen table, on the phone together night after night, piecing together a truth the county had buried 40 years before. Thomas told Karen everything, all of it. Everything in the shoebox, and everything that had never made it into the shoebox, because it lived only in his memory. The debts, Vernon case, the crooked grain scale, Daniel's little notebook full of double-weighed loads, Ruth begging him to leave it alone, the threat on the porch, and most of all, the tire track, the wide, heavy track of a big truck, photographed and cast by a tired detective and quietly, illegally, handed off years later so it wouldn't die when he did. Thomas read Karen the measurements off Alder's old notes. He described the flat, friendly voice at the truck window. These roads can be real dangerous after dark. For 40 years, Thomas said, he had believed Vernon Casey murdered Daniel and Ruth to keep them from exposing the fraud. That part he'd been sure of. But he had never once been able to explain the baby. If they'd killed the whole family, where was Emily's body? The searches had covered every field for miles. Divers had gone in the river. How does a 4-month-old just cease to exist and leave less trace than her parents? For 40 years, that question had been a splinter Thomas couldn't reach. Now, Finally, sitting in his barn with the phone against his ear and the wren on its nail, he understood. They hadn't killed the baby. Karen and Thomas built the timeline together across a dozen late-night phone calls. She at her computer following the paper. He supplying the human truth of Cedar Hollow that no record held. In May of 1984, Daniel Vance had assembled enough evidence to destroy Vernon Case, the double-weighed loads, the dates, the numbers, all of it in that pocket notebook, and he'd made one fatal mistake. He'd told Vernon. Karen believed, and Thomas came to agree, that Daniel had probably meant it as leverage. Forgive my debt and let the other farmers alone, or I take this to the state. A desperate young man trying to save his farm and do right at the same time. He'd thought he was negotiating. He didn't understand the kind of man he was negotiating with. To Vernon Case, Daniel's threat wasn't a bargaining chip. It was a death sentence, Daniel's, not Vernon's. That Sunday evening, Daniel and Ruth hadn't been driving to Ruth's sister's at all. That was the cover story Daniel gave Thomas, which was why he hadn't quite met his brother's eyes at the door. They'd been driving to a meeting, somewhere private, somewhere Vernon or Vernon's men had arranged, 60 miles out on a lonely gravel road where a family had no reason to be. Maybe Daniel thought he was going to settle the debt. Maybe he thought he was safe because he'd hidden a copy of the evidence. Whatever he thought, he brought Ruth. And Ruth would not leave a 4-month-old. So Emily came too, bundled in her yellow blanket, asleep in the back. The heavy truck met them on that road. Karen and Thomas would never know the exact choreography of that night, whether the Vances were run off the road or flagged down or simply followed to a stop. But the wide tire track in the mud told the end of it. Vernon's men killed Daniel and Ruth on that gravel shoulder, and they hid the two bodies in 2 different places, 11 miles apart. Because 2 graves that are never found together can never tell a single story. A skull by a fence line. A woman in a shallow trench that wouldn't be disturbed for 19 years. Careful, professional, cold. And then they faced the problem no killer plans for. A baby, alive, awake, in the back seat. What happened in the dark on that road, Karen and Thomas could only reconstruct from what came later and from what one dying man would eventually confess. But the shape of it was this. The men could not do it. Whether it was the last thread of conscience in hard men, or superstition, or simple animal revulsion at the thing in front of them, or an order from Vernon himself drawing the one line even he wouldn't cross, they could not put that baby in a grave. So they took her. And they carried her to the one place a person like Vernon Case would know to carry an inconvenient baby that needed to disappear cleanly and profitably. Because Vernon Case, Karen discovered, had a sister-in-law. And the sister-in-law, 2 states away in Ohio, ran a private adoption service. That was the polite name for it. Karen found the real shape of it in old court records, because operations like this always eventually leave a trail. And this one had surfaced decades later as a footnote in an unrelated fraud prosecution. Its records digitized and then forgotten in a county archive where a patient woman with a cold cup of coffee could find them at 2 in the morning. It was a cash-only baby placement operation, the kind that flourished in the gaps of the era's paperwork. It found desperate childless couples, and it found babies from wherever babies could be found. Unwed mothers, yes, but also, when the price was right, from sources that bore no examination at all. It kept 2 sets of books. It asked no questions and answered none. It dressed itself in the language of Christian charity, and it was, stripped of the language, a business that sold children. In its surviving ledger, in an entry dated June of 1984, 1 month after the Vance family vanished off a gravel road, Karen found a line. Infant female, Approximately 5 months. No surname on record. Placement fee, $4,000. Placed, an Ohio couple named. And in the margin, in faded pencil, in a hand different from the rest of the entry, 3 characters that turned Karen's blood to ice water when she understood them. Ref VK. Referred by VK Vernon Case. Vernon Casa had murdered the parents and sold the baby. He had turned his brother's death, his neighbor's death, a young man's only crime being decency, into a $4,000 profit. He had erased an entire family off the face of the earth and made money on the last living piece of it. Emily Vance had been handed, 1 month after her parents' murder, to a childless couple from Ohio named, well, their name doesn't matter now, and they deserve to have it left out of this. Because of everything in this story, they may be the only people besides the Vances who were purely innocent. They were a good couple. They desperately wanted a child and could not have one. They went to what they believed was a legitimate, if discreet, Christian adoption agency. And they were told they were being blessed with an orphan girl who needed a home. And they paid the fee they were asked to pay. And they signed the papers they were given. And they took home a baby and named her Amanda. And loved her, without reservation, for the rest of their lives. They never knew her parents had been murdered 11 miles apart in a Missouri spring. They never knew the $4,000 they'd paid in joy had gone into the pocket of the man who killed them. And, like so many adoptive parents of that generation, they made a choice they thought was kindness. They never told Amanda she was adopted at all. They took that secret to their graves, both of them, believing they were sparing her. And so Emily Vance became Amanda, an only child in a quiet Ohio suburb, and grew up believing beyond any doubt that the 2 people who raised her were her flesh and blood. She had her mother's habit of humming while she cooked, though she never knew where she got it. She'd wanted as a girl to be a teacher, though she'd become a hospital billing administrator instead. She married, divorced, had no children of her own, made a small good life. And at 58, alone in the evenings, the way Karen was alone, she saw one of those Christmas commercials and thought, idly, I wonder where my people really come from. And she bought a DNA kit, and she spit in the tube, and she ticked the box she didn't read. And she mailed it off and set in motion an avalanche that had been waiting 40 years to fall. Now Karen Doyle faced the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. Somewhere in Ohio, a 58-year-old woman named Amanda was living an ordinary Tuesday. She had a job and a car and a mailbox and a favorite mug and a whole scaffolding of understanding about who she was and where she came from. And every beam of that scaffolding was about to be pulled out at once. Karen and Thomas argued about how to do it for 2 straight nights. Thomas, weeping, wanted to get in his truck and drive to Ohio that very hour and knock on her door and take his brother's daughter in his arms. 40 years he'd waited. He could not bear another week. Karen understood that hunger completely, and she gently, firmly refused to let him act on it. Because here was the thing Karen had grasped. The principle she would not violate. Amanda was a grown woman. She was not a lost object to be recovered and returned. She was a person with a right, the deepest right there is, to learn the truth of her own origin on her own terms, at her own pace, or, if she chose, to refuse to learn it at all. Whatever Amanda decided, it had to be Amanda's decision. They would not do to her what Vernon Case had done to her. They would not decide her life for her. They would not ambush her with it, however loving the ambush. She had been taken once, without her consent, and moved and renamed and rewritten. She would not be taken again, even in kindness. So Karen wrote a letter. She wrote it 14 times before she got it right. She read drafts to Thomas over the phone and tore them up. The wrong letter could break this woman, could feel like a scam, a cruelty, a bomb in the mailbox. Karen threw out every version that said too much. In the end, the letter she mailed was very short and very careful. She said she was a genetic genealogist who worked with DNA to help reunite families. She said that Amanda's DNA had come back as a match to a family that had been searching for a lost relative for a very, very long time of 40 years. She said she understood this might come as a shock, and that Amanda was under no obligation to do anything at all. She said only that, if Amanda ever wished to know more, anything more, she could call the number at the bottom, any time, day or night, and Karen would answer. She enclosed no photographs. She named no names. She made no demands and applied no pressure. She sealed it, and she drove to the post office herself rather than trust it to her own mailbox. And she sent it, and then she and Thomas began to wait. It was the longest wait of Thomas Vance's life. And Thomas Vance was a man who knew about waiting. 9 days passed. Thomas barely slept and barely ate. He sat in his kitchen through the long evenings with the wren in his hand, turning it over and over, the smooth, worn wood catching the light, 40 years of sawdust and sorrow, polished into it by his own thumb. He'd carved that bird for a baby he'd known for 4 months. That baby was a gray-haired woman now, somewhere in Ohio, holding an envelope, deciding. He didn't pray exactly. He'd lost the habit long ago, somewhere around his father's deathbed. But he sat with the wren, and if that wasn't a prayer, it was the closest thing he had. On the 10th day, in the late morning, Karen Doyle's phone rang, and the number was an Ohio area code, and Karen's heart nearly stopped. She answered on the second ring. "This is Karen." A silence. Then a woman's voice, careful and frightened, and trying very hard to sound calm. "Is this Karen Doyle, the one who wrote to me?" Yes, it's me. Thank you for calling." "My name is Amanda. I got your letter. I've read it about 100 times." A shaky breath. "I don't understand it. My parents never said anything about, I'm not there, must be some kind of mistake, because I'm not adopted. My parents would have." The careful calm cracked straight down the middle. "Who am I matched to? What family? What is this?" And Karen Doyle, as gently as she had ever said anything to another human being, told her the truth. She told her about a young couple named Daniel and Ruth Vance on a little dairy farm outside Cedar Hollow, Missouri, 40 years ago. She told her how they'd loved each other since they were 16, how Ruth had a laugh you could hear across a room and hummed hymns while she cooked. She told her about their baby girl, born in the January cold, so beloved her father wept in the hospital hall. She told her, carefully, about a powerful man and a crooked scale and a young farmer too decent to look away, and about a Sunday evening in May when a family drove east into the gold light and never came home. She told her about the abandoned car and the warm bottle and the untouched cash. She told her about 40 years of a lie called runaway, and an uncle who never believed it for a single day. And then Karen told her the last thing. The baby in the newspaper, Amanda. Emily. The one everyone believed vanished with her parents that night. Karen's voice was steady and full of tears at the same time. She didn't vanish. She was taken out of that car, and she was carried far away, and she was given a new name and a new family and a whole new life. She grew up loved. She grew up safe. She grew up never knowing any of this had ever happened to her. A pause. Amanda. The DNA doesn't leave any room for doubt. There's no mistake. You are that baby. You are Emily Vance. You were never a runaway's child, and you were never nobody's. You were loved, from the day you were born, by people who died because one of them tried to do the right thing. And you've been alive and safe this whole time, right where you were meant to be, while a whole family 2 states away grieved you and never, ever stopped looking. There was a silence on the line so long that Karen thought she'd lost her. And then a sound came down the phone that Karen Doyle would carry for the rest of her life, a low, cracking, helpless sob. The sound of a 58-year-old woman's entire understanding of herself coming apart, and underneath it, something else beginning. Not just grief, recognition. Some part of Amanda, Karen would always believe, had heard the name Emily and known it. The way you know a word in a language you spoke before you can remember. There's someone, Karen said softly, when the sobbing had quieted to breathing, who has waited 40 years just to know you're alive. He's your uncle, your father's little brother. His name is Thomas. He was 19 when you were born, and he held you in the doorway the last night, and you grabbed his finger and wouldn't let go. Karen's own voice broke completely now. Before you were even born, Amanda, he carved you a little wooden bird, a wren, for your crib. It got left behind that night, and he's kept it on a shelf in his barn for 40 years. He's looked at it every single day. He never gave up on you, not for one day in 40 years. It took 3 more weeks after that phone call. Amanda needed time, needed it desperately, and Karen and Thomas gave it to her without a word of pressure. Because they had promised themselves and each other that this would move at Amanda's pace and no one else's, ever. She did what a careful, shaken person does. She had her DNA independently retested through a second company, quietly, half hoping it would come back different. It came back the same. She was Emily Vance. She dug up the old newspaper articles online and read them for herself. And she sat for a long time, looking at that grainy photograph of Daniel and Ruth Vance holding a baby in a yellow blanket. And she saw, in the shape of the young mother's smile, pressed against a laughing baby's cheek, her own smile. The one that looked back at her from the mirror every morning. The one she'd always assumed she got from the Ohio mother who, she now understood, had shared not one gene with her. That was its own grief, and Karen never let anyone minimize it. Amanda loved the people who raised her. They were her parents, in every way that a life is actually lived. And she had to sit with the terrible knowledge that they had, however innocently, however deceived themselves, been part of the machinery that erased her, that they had paid $4,000 for her, without ever asking the questions that might have saved her family's names decades sooner. Amanda came, slowly, to understand that they had been lied to as cruelly as everyone else, that they were victims of Vernon Case too, in their way. But it took time. It all took time. And Karen and Thomas gave her every hour of it she needed. And then, on a cold, bright morning in the middle of December, Amanda decided she was ready. She got in her car in Ohio and she drove west, alone, for 8 hours, to Cedar Hollow, Missouri, to meet the uncle who had never stopped looking for her. Thomas Vance stood on the porch of the old farmhouse and watched a car he didn't recognize come slowly up the gravel drive, the same gravel drive down which his brother had backed a car full of family into the gold light 40 years before. He was 70 pounds lighter than he'd been at 19 and about 100 years older. He'd been up since 4. He'd shaved twice. He'd rehearsed 100 things to say, and watching the car crawl toward him, he forgot every single one of them. The car stopped. The engine ticked. The door opened. A woman got out, 58 years old, silver coming into her dark hair. And Thomas saw, across 40 feet of frozen yard, in a face he had last seen at 4 months old, he saw Daniel. Daniel's serious brow, and Ruth's mouth. Ruth's exact mouth, the one that had kissed his cheek in a doorway a lifetime ago. His brother and his sister-in-law, both of them, alive again in the face of a frightened, gray-haired stranger standing beside her car, twisting her gloved hands, not knowing what to do. Thomas came down the porch steps. His legs barely held him. He crossed the yard. "Emily," he said, the name no living voice had spoken aloud in 40 years. "And Amanda." Emily made a sound and came apart and crossed the last of the frozen distance between them and fell into the arms of the uncle who had never once, in 4 decades, stopped believing she would come home. He wrapped her up the way he had wrapped her up exactly one time before, when she was 4 months old and asleep in a yellow blanket, and the whole world was still ahead of them. Before a gravel road swallowed everything, he held his brother's daughter, and he shook and he wept, and she wept. And above them, through the frosted window of the barn workshop, on its nail where it had hung for 40 years, the little wooden wren sat quietly in the winter light, waiting, as it had always waited, for the child it was made for. The case did not end in a courtroom, and that was the one wound that never fully closed. The man most responsible, Vernon Case, who murdered 2 people and sold their baby for $4,000, had been dead and comfortably buried for 26 years, mourned by a church full of people, his name on a brass plaque at the hospital. He would never answer for a single thing he did. He'd gotten clean away, all the way to a peaceful death in his sleep, and no exhumation, no trial, no verdict could reach him now. Thomas raged against that. For weeks after the reunion, the old fury came back on him hard that the smiling man had won, that the world had let him win, that there was no justice large enough to matter. And then, slowly, he let it go. Not because it stopped being unfair, because rage had already eaten 40 years of his life, and he was old, and he had his niece back, and he would not surrender the years he had left to a dead man who deserved none of them. But the truth came out, all of it, at last, and this time it did not go back in a drawer. Karen Doyle's complete file, the tree, the match, the ledger, the identification of the remains, went to the Missouri State Highway Patrol's Cold Case Unit, and to a young investigator there who read it in one sitting, and then, by her own account, sat at her desk for a long time before she could move. This time, the case did not go cold. Investigators formally identified the 2 sets of remains, at long last, as Daniel and Ruth Vance, and gave them back their names after 40 years of being unidentified adult male and unidentified adult female in 2 separate files. They pulled the ancient grain elevator records and confirmed, decades too late, exactly the fraud Daniel had died, trying to expose the crooked scale, the skimmed weights, the trail of ruined farms. They found the adoption ledger and the faded pencil note in the margin, Ref VK, and it became the thread that finally tied Vernon Case to the vanished baby. And they found 2 of Vernon's men, old men now, in their 80s, who had driven the heavy truck and dug the 2 graves and carried a baby to Ohio, and lived 40 ordinary years afterward. One of them died before charges could be filed. But the other, facing the end of his own life, with the police at his door and the ledger on the table, confessed. He confessed all of it, and in his confession, at last, was the answer to the question that had been a splinter in Thomas Vance's heart for 40 years. The old man described that night on the gravel road. He described a young man who wouldn't stop talking, even then, even at the end, about how what Vernon was doing was wrong, about how somebody had to stop it. He described a young woman who stopped begging for herself the moment she understood, and begged only for the baby. Not the baby, please, please, whatever you do, not the baby. And he described the decision made in the dark. 3 hard men standing over a crying infant, and how not one of them could do it, and how they'd carried her to the truck instead and driven her toward a place Vernon knew. And how in 40 years of ordinary life, the old man said he had thought about that baby every single day. He said he'd always wondered what became of her. He said he was glad, at the end, to learn she'd lived. It was the only thing, he said, that he wasn't ashamed of. It was not justice. Not really. Not the kind that balances a scale. But it was the truth, complete and on the record. And for Thomas Vance, the truth was the thing he'd been starving for across 4 decades. The runaway story was dead. His brother's name was clean. Everyone would know now that Daniel Vance had not abandoned his farm and his family and his little brother in the night. Everyone would know he'd died because he was too good to look away. And finally, this was the part Thomas had never let himself hope for. Daniel and Ruth Vance were laid to rest. Properly, together. Side by side in the Cedar Hollow Methodist churchyard, under a single gray stone, 40 years after they drove east into the gold light. It was a small service on a cold, clear day. Emily stood at the graveside between her Uncle Thomas and Karen Doyle, the retired schoolteacher from Illinois, who had refused, at 2 a.m, to let a knot go untangled, and who had driven down to stand with the family she'd given back to itself. Detective Roy Alder was long dead, but his daughter came. She brought her father's old file, the one he was never supposed to keep, and she laid the photograph of that unmatched tire track on the fresh-turned earth of the grave, because her father had asked her to, years before he died, on the chance the truth ever came out. He never forgave himself, she told Thomas quietly. It aided him his whole life that he couldn't prove it. He always said somebody with a big truck was on that road. He was right. I wanted him to be here for that. So I brought him. Emily kept the name Amanda. She'd been Amanda for 58 years, loved under that name, every one of them. And she decided, with Thomas's blessing, with everyone's blessing, that she didn't have to choose between the 2 halves of herself. She could be Amanda, who was raised by a good Ohio couple who wanted her more than anything in the world. And she could be Emily Vance, daughter of Daniel and Ruth, niece of Thomas, a girl who was fought for and grieved for and never given up on across 40 years. Both were true. Both were hers. She'd lost a whole family before she could walk, and she'd gained a whole history in her 50s, and she decided to hold all of it, the grief and the gift together, because that was the only honest way to hold it. She came back to Cedar Hollow often after that first cold December morning. She learned the quiet Missouri fields where her father had walked. She sat in the barn while Thomas worked and let him tell her every story he had, 40 years of them, saved up. She was learning, at 58, who her mother's laugh had sounded like, and that she'd come by her humming honestly, and that she had her father's stubborn streak, which Thomas said, laughing and crying at once, was the truest proof of blood there was. On her last visit of that first winter, as she was leaving, Thomas stopped her at the door of the barn. He took the little wooden wren down off its nail off the nail where it had hung for 4 decades. Through his marriage and his father's death and Susan's death and all the long gray years of waiting, he pressed it into his niece's hands, and he closed her fingers around it with both of his. It was always yours, he said, his voice thick. I just kept it safe for you. That's all I was ever doing. All this time, I was just keeping it safe till you came home. Emily held the wren against her chest and could not speak. In the end, that is what this story is really about. Not the smiling man who did the killing and escaped this world without ever facing it. He is the smallest part of it, in the end, for all the harm he did. It is about the people who refused to stop looking. It is about a tired old detective who broke the rules to slip a photograph to a grieving boy because he couldn't stand to let the truth die entirely. It is about that boy who became an old man and who kept a little wooden bird on a nail for 40 years because as long as the bird was there, some part of him refused to accept that the baby was gone for good. And it is about a lonely retired school teacher who talked to her computer at midnight and drank her coffee cold and believed with her whole heart that everyone deserves to be found. The people who vanish are not always running away. Sometimes they are silenced for daring to tell the truth. Sometimes they are hidden by the very people who wronged them, folded so completely into a new life that even they forget they were ever lost. And sometimes, against every odd, past every year, through every drawer where a nameless file gathers dust, some small living piece of them survives, grows up, grows old, buys a DNA kit out of idle curiosity on an ordinary evening, and without ever knowing it, carries the whole buried truth home. The darkness in this world is real, and it is patient, and sometimes it wins for a very long time. 40 years in this case. Long enough for a killer to die in his sleep, and a father to die of a broken heart, and a good detective to die still ashamed. But not forever. Because in the end, love proved stronger than the darkness. It always does. It just sometimes takes 40 years. And one small detail, and a stranger who refuses to look away, and a little wooden wren kept safe on a nail, waiting all that time for a lost girl to finally come home.